Good morning. I am Reverend Rudra Dundzila, and my pronouns are he, his, him. I am glad to be here this morning, and I know one of the signs of upcoming spring is already out there, and it involves orange cones. It's construction season. Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. Our hymnal, our gray hymnal, is called Singing the Living Tradition. Something that is alive is not static. It keeps changing, it keeps transforming, it keeps evolving. Something keeps happening. And we are a religious movement that keeps transforming. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus teaches that the only certainty is change. That's the only thing that we can really know about life. Something is going to change. Buddhism reminds us that everything in life is impermanent. So at this time of year, this season right now in particular, both Eastern and Western Christianity is celebrating Lent, and Muslims are currently in Ramadan. Shortly, in a month, Jews will be celebrating Passover for a week. And Buddhist monks traditionally participate in an annual 3-month retreat during the rainy season, which could be interpreted loosely depending on where the monks are found in the world, because the rainy season sort of changes based on local climate. And through such times, through such religious celebrations, people are seeking to transform themselves. So we had Fat Tuesday this week. I hope you got a really good punchki for Fat Tuesday, and they have used ones on sales at the stores I still saw over the weekend. But we as Unitarian Universalists, we don't have an annual retreat season like some of these other religious traditions do. We do create our own times for retreat for our communities. So for example, next month, the Unitarian Universalist Buddhist Fellowship will hold its semi-annual convocation or retreat with the Lama Rod Owens as a Dharma teacher. He's a queer African-American writer who's written a number of books on Buddhism and engaged Buddhism in the world. Individual spiritual transformation is the goal of such retreats. Christians and Muslims undertake fasts, penance, and almsgiving. Muslims fast from food and water from dawn to dusk, and they experience hunger by day. Sufi mystics, part of the Muslim tradition, have interpreted such experience of hunger as solidarity with those who suffer from the lack of food on an ongoing basis in their lives. It's a reminder of being connected with people who do not have enough to survive. Fasting inspires empathy. Fasting is also political. Our federal government has canceled school breakfasts and lunch programs in its proposed budget for next year. 1/5 of the USA's children rely on these meals for their essential nutrition. Their families are already living on the economic edge. These children otherwise face food insecurity and malnutrition, according to the School Nutrition Association. And our country is going to take away these meals from them. Another example of fasting as politics. Soviet Russia occupied Ukraine from 1922 to 1991 and annexed Western Ukraine to the occupation in 1945. Ukrainians repeatedly refused to acquiesce to the Russian occupation. In 1932-1933, the Soviet dictator Stalin cut off food supplies to the rebellious Ukrainians. They were banned from eating even the food that they grew on their grounds because all of it was on their farms, because all of it was taken away from them by the government. Ukraine is otherwise known as the breadbasket of Europe. In 1932, 1933, 3.5 million to 5 million Ukrainians died by forced starvation. It's called the Holodomor, or murder by starvation, and it is considered an international act of genocide. Breathe. On a lighter note, the Prophet Muhammad originally required abstinence from sex during Ramadan for all 28 days of Ramadan. But the men complained about it. Not the woman now. The men complained about it. And then the Prophet Muhammad received another revelation from God that permitted sex during Ramadan. Isn't it interesting how prophecy works in religion? Not only in early Islamic Arabia, but say also among modern American evangelicals. When we come out of retreat, we are often transformed. Transformation is a long-standing Unitarian and Universalist value. And I'm going to go through several historic examples of how our shared religious tradition has lifted up the importance of transformation. In the Transcendentalist era, from the 1830s to the 1860s, authors like the Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson, some of you have probably heard of him in high school, or Henry David Thoreau, Walden Pond, Louisa May Alcott, Little Women, Margaret Fuller, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and Elizabeth Palmer Peabody advocated for what they called self-reliance. We might call it self-actualization nowadays. They sought deep contemplation, connection with the oversoul, and unity to nature. And at the same time, they rejected traditional religion and materialism. They sought to transform themselves to become the best possible people they could possibly be and affect society that way. Next example. Both Universalists and Unitarians in the early 1900s were an active part of the progressive Christian social gospel movement. Unitarian Reverend John Haynes Holmes, who protested the USA's involvement in World War I, Universalist Reverend Clarence Skinner, and others applied Jesus' ethical teachings to social problems, especially the wealth gap, poverty, alcoholism, crime, racism. 100 years ago, they were talking about racism in our country, pollution, child labor, workers' rights, the poor status of American schools, and the dangers of war. That was their agenda. Does that sound familiar to us today? I think we're still concerned with these issues in our great country. Reverend Holmes became one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. And he's also one of the co-founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, two organizations inspired by Unitarian values. Unitarian Jane Addams became the symbolic figurehead of the settlement movement. Settlement houses helped the impoverished and immigrants who were living in inner city squalor to improve their lives. All of these goals sought to transform society, especially for the marginalized and underprivileged groups in it. Another example, After World War I, which is supposed to be the war to end all wars, as you might recall from history class, Unitarians aligned with the ethical culture movement that evolved from Reform Judaism. Its motto was, not by the creed, but by the deed. Does that motto sound familiar to you in some form? Unitarians, Reverend Charles Francis Potter, John Dewey, Reverend Curtis Reese, and Reverend John Dietrich, and others, women were missing from this group. They advocated morality for its own sake, for the common good, not because of laws, not because of social mores, or not because of threats of an afterlife punishment. Those they rejected. They said that people can be good because we have an innate drive in ourselves to become good and to share that goodness. And that is what inspired them with their teachings, their ethical humanist teachings. They focused on charitable laws, on social reform, education, and universal health care. We're still talking about those things today. They transformed themselves first and sought to transform society for the good of all people in society. Two more examples. These are sadder examples. During World War II, the Unitarian minister, Reverend Waitzel, and his social worker wife, Martha Sharp, traveled to Prague, Czechoslovakia, to the largest Unitarian congregation in the world. It was 3,800 members strong, led by the Reverend Norbert Čapek. With the help from the American Unitarian Association, they addressed the humanitarian crisis under Nazi occupation. The Unitarian Service Committee was born, which we now call the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. They helped Jews, Jewish children, and others escape Europe, limited only by the United States' refusal to grant Jews refugee visas to escape Nazism. Our country did that. Alas, they could not save Reverend Čapek. The Nazis arrested him, burned his books and sermons, and gassed him in a concentration camp. There's an old Jewish saying from the Talmud: whoever saves a single life is considered by Scripture to have saved the world. They saved lives. They transformed the world. The final example. 60 years ago, in March 1965, this weekend, Unitarian Universalist Viola Luiso from Detroit drove down to Selma, Alabama after the March 7th Bloody Sunday beatings of peaceful protesters. She went there to help the local civil rights organizers. 3 weeks later, the Ku Klux Klan, by the way, the slogan of the official slogan of the Klan is America First. The Ku Klux Klan murdered her in her car while she was transporting civil rights workers home. She put her life on the line to transform the lives of others. This is our shared Unitarian Universalist heritage of transformation, self-transformation, and world transformation. Our tradition has strived for both individual and social transformation to create a better world for all people with no exceptions. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritage, never complete. and never perfect. We keep changing. We are not the same people. We are not the same religious community as we were centuries ago, 4 centuries ago, during the Protestant Reformation, when our ancestors landed at Plymouth Rock. We're not the same community. We're not the same people as 63 years ago, when the Unitarian and the Universalist denominations merged together. We transformed, transform, and we keep transforming in our living tradition. Individually, we seek to transform ourselves to become better people, to become more loving people, deeply loving people, people filled with loving kindness. And that's like when we sung that hymn. That challenges us to evolve. It is not just for our own sake, for our own selves that we are doing this. We are doing this because we seek to transform the world for the good of all. We envision a world where all have their fundamental needs met for food, housing, clothing, education, healthcare, employment with a living wage. That should be the norm. That should be what society looks like. And yet in our country, so many people are now struggling to find affordable food. And the cost of housing is simply skyrocketing out of control, with homelessness becoming a growing pandemic in our country. We seek a world where all people can thrive and where all children can live out their dreams. As people of faith, as Unitarian Universalists, we confront the systems of power, privilege, and oppression that create barriers for marginalized groups, those barriers that push people out, that push people away, that don't allow people to share in the wealth and goodness that our nation has to offer. We seek to replace such barriers with ever widening, ever broadening. Raise up your arms, stretch up your arms sideways. We seek a world where all these people are welcome to live in freedom. Transformation is a spiritual labor, not in the sense of work, but in the sense of birthing, in the sense of creating new life. Transformation is spiritual. And transformation is also political. In recreating our world, we seek a world where all are accepted, not some. Where all can live freely, not just some. And where all can thrive, not just some.